Okay, today we're talking about Unit 7, Natural Selection. We're talking about the origin of species. So, first, let's define what a species is. Species is a group of organisms that can interbreed. So, in other words, they can breed with each other and they can produce offspring that are healthy. And then the offspring are fertile and able to produce other offspring. So we're going to talk about how one group can then diverge off and become multiple different species. But before we do that, we're going to watch a short YouTube clip about the speciation song that'll help kind of set the stage for what. Okay, so the first thing that has to happen is you need to start off with a group of organisms. Somehow they need to be separated from each other, okay? And that can occur in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to go through those in a few minutes. So if you look at this population, they end up being separated by a mountain range in between the two groups. Okay, so step one is the group needs to be separated. Step two is there needs to already be some variations within the population. So if you look on the left side of the mountain and the right side of the mountain, there's already some naturally occurring variations. There's some that have one piece of hair, there's some that have three pieces of hair, there's some that are taller, there's some that are shorter. So the variation must already exist. And we already talked about the different ways the variations could get there. Random genetic mutation, sexual reproduction. There's a lot of ways that mutations come to be. Um, but we need the separation of the group and we need some variation. So then what scientists have to ask themselves is there just variation between the population? Is it still the same species? There's just some differences? Or have those groups now become so different from one another that it's actually created a new species? And if that's the case, then when they mate with one another, their offspring are not going to be fertile. So that does a good job of kind of summing it up. The groups need to be separated. All right. There needs to be some variation. And, we've got some organisms living on one side of the mountain, some living on the other side of the mountain. Therefore, their environment becomes a little bit different. Over time, they're only mating with each other. They're not ever mating across the mountain because they can't. So, what's going to happen is changes will accumulate over time. And the groups will become more and more different from one another. And then eventually, over time, they'll become so different, they'll actually be considered two different species. Okay. There's quite a few different ways that this can happen. They're referred to as reproductive isolation. Okay. So, in other words, how could the species be separated for such a long period of time that they become two new species? Two different ways. The first, like kind of broad category, is called pre-zygotic barriers, and the second one is called post-zygotic barriers. Okay, so in pre-zygotic barriers prevent fertilization from ever even happening. There's quite a few different ways that that can happen. They're listed here on your Google slide, and we're going to go through some more specific examples. And then there's post-zygotic barriers. Post-zygotic barriers are fertilization occurs, but then there's something wrong with the offspring. Here's how you read this diagram. Starting from left to right, it shows you the different types of pre-zygotic barriers. First one is called habitat isolation. So imagine this, you have a group of snakes all living in the same area. But what happens is the group splits off. Some of them eventually go and live in more of a watery environment, like you see in diagram A. Some of them go and live in a drier environment, like you see in group B. The two groups, because they are living in different habitats, don't interact with each other anymore. They only mate within their own little groups. The water snakes mate with the water snakes, and the dryland snakes mate with the dryland snakes. Therefore, they don't interact with each other anymore. What will happen is eventually over time, the two groups will become so different, changes will accumulate that they are now considered a different species. Second example of this is called temporal isolation. Temporal means time. Okay, so this can happen a couple different ways. Again, starts off as one group. The group splits for whatever reason. If you look at these, are skunks down in here in the next example. For example, if in C, those skunks are mating only during the springtime. And maybe D, that group is now mating only during the summertime. So since they're mating during different times of the year, they're never mating with each other. It could be different times of the day. So some are, looking for mates at night, and others are looking for mates during the day. It could be times of the year. So whatever reason, they no longer mate with each other. Again, linked to time. The third one is called behavioral isolation. What happens, again, you start with one group, they separate off for whatever reason. This example here, these are the blue-footed boobies. And what these birds do is they have a specific dance that they do in order to attract a mate. And you see this a lot in the animal kingdom. If one group, the males are doing a specific type of dance in order to woo the females, in another group, maybe they're not doing that dance. So if the male went over to the other group, the females would be like, what are they doing? So again, they're just acting different. Whatever, they're acting different where they become so different from one another and their behaviors are so different that they don't mate with each other. The fourth one is called mechanical isolation, and it's just like it sounds. Like from the video, the lock no longer fits the key. So an example of this is species of snails, and actually the curling of their shell prevents them from mating with one another because of the fact that where their genitalia is exposed in one species of snail, it's exposed like on the right side of the shell, and the other one, it's the left side of the shell, so they no longer can match up and mate with one another. The last pre-zygotic barrier is called gametic isolation. And this has to do with, here's an example of sea urchins. So their reproduction is external fertilization. And what happens sometimes, and we'll see this in fish as well, is on the surface of the egg and sperm, there are specific proteins. So if the proteins over time become so different, what'll happen is the sperm of one will no longer even recognize the egg of another. Therefore, fertilization can't occur. Post-zygotic barriers. And remember, post-zygotic barriers, fertilization has occurred. Okay, so fertilization has happened, but then there's something wrong with the offspring. So the first category there is called reduced hybrid viability. Hybrid is just a mixture of like a combination of genes. Like you guys are a hybrid because you're half your mom, half your dad. So that's all that means. So reduced hybrid viability means the two groups can still mate with one another, but their offspring, it says reduce hybrid viability. That means like likelihood to live on. So the offspring are not healthy. So the two groups still meet up, they still mate with each other, but their offspring are not healthy enough. They don't probably survive into adulthood, therefore they don't have any additional offspring. The second one is called reduced hybrid fertility. What happens here is the two groups have become different, okay, but they still mate with one another. The problem is their offspring are infertile. So a perfect example of this, as you see here, is the horse and the donkey. Horse and a donkey can mate with one another, but they have what is called a mule, and mules are infertile. So mules cannot reproduce. And so in order to get more mules, it always has to be a horse and a donkey. Another example of that is a ligers. So a liger is an actual organism. So it is a tiger mating with a lion, and they have things called ligers. But ligers are infertile. Okay, and then the last one is called hybrid breakdown. So the two groups still mate with each other, and really we only see this in plants. And the first generation of offspring is probably fine. They're still fertile. They can reproduce. But then like the second, third, fourth generation, there's a problem. So it takes time for that to break down. So the post-zygotic barriers, once again, is fertilization happens, but there is something wrong with the offspring. Okay, there's two different ways. We kind of categorize them in the two different ways that speciation can occur, two vocabulary words. One of them is called allopatric speciation. So it's when they're actually geographically separated. So if you think about habitat isolation, it's called allopatric. Sympatric is when the organisms still live in the same area. So that's the diagram on the right. Just for whatever reason, they're not mating with one another. There's a good example of fish where there's like red fish and blue fish, and they could be completely separated, like maybe the lake is drying up. That would be allopatric, or sympatric would be bluefish just decide they only want to mate with bluefish. So they're still all living in the lake together. They're just choosing who they're going to mate with is a little bit differently. Okay, what happens is when this separation has occurred, it will then take time, but over time, what's going to happen is each population will adapt to its environment. Changes will accumulate. Eventually, you end up with two new species. Okay, there's a word that's called adaptive radiation. A perfect example of this is the Darwin finches. Okay, so usually what happens is it's relatively kind of a fast evolution, but all of these species of finches, if you look at the diagram, they all came from a common ancestor. So what happened is the group split off and they went to live in different areas. Okay, and based on where they were living is what kind of food they were eating. So what happened was, finches that were living, on the kind of your left side of your screen there, they were eating nectar. So really the only way for them to get the nectar was the ones that had like long, pointier kind of beaks. Okay, and then what happened over time is the finches became more and more different because they were living in different environments and they were eating different things, and nature did the selecting. And the one that was most fit for the environment reproduced more. And then over time, we had lots of different species of finches. Okay. If you look at the fossil record, we've talked about fossils a little bit, you'll see that lots of times what's going to happen is there can either be a gradual move, and you can see that different fossils are evolving and kind of species are evolving over time. We can see it in the fossil record. Otherwise, other times it's just something very quick. Like we found tons of these organisms, fossils of the organism, and all of a sudden they were all gone. Okay, so the idea behind that is gradualism versus a punctuated equilibrium. What we mean by that is gradualism is on the left. And it's saying there was a common ancestor, and then very slowly over time, the group split off and adapted to their surrounding. Punctuated equilibrium on the right is more when something drastic happens in the environment. And there's a very quick change to the species based on who then becomes more fit for the environment.